Now, so far I focused just on women because gender expectations for adolescent girls have changed, but so have gender expectations for boys. And your textbook specifically refers to somebody named Anthony Rotundo, who wrote a book called American Manhood. And what he does in this book is focus on how masculinity has evolved over the years. So, who is a real man? Who do we consider naturally male? How does a manly man act? And what he does is he looks at how manliness has formed from boyhood through youth and into adulthood, although he doesn't include a discussion of old age. So he discusses things like sex and marriage relations, the bonds between mothers and sons and fathers and sons, how we developed this ideal of athleticism for men, how we've developed this habit of worshiping or kind of seen as heroic, really successful entrepreneurs. He looks at culture and identity. He looks at the historical roots for the scorn for male homosexuality. And what he does in part is he looks at letters that were written in each period that he focuses on. And he very clearly states that manhood, our ideas of manhood, are man-made, or they are socially constructed. Now, he begins by looking at colonial America, a time when, of course, society was very different because it wasn't urbanized at all. Instead, if you think of society at that time, it was a bunch of smaller communities with much less travel. And because of that, communities were much more tightly knit than they are now. And of course, at that time, all of society was pretty much built on religion and religious ideology. And during this area, Mr. Rotundo refers to what he calls communal manhood, meaning the focus of gender expectations for adolescent boys was on preparing to assume adult responsibilities in work and marriage. So in colonial America, communal manhood really emphasized these close community bonds. Communal manhood really emphasized that the man is the head of the household. And he calls this communal manhood because of just that, because um, your personal identity would be so closely tied to your community, a very collectivistic approach. So he said that at that time, preparing to be a man was the same as preparing to be the head of a household, because they would be expected to be a provider and a protector. Very similar to the requirements now of manhood in traditional culture, with this emphasis on learning to provide and protect. The process might be different. What's required to demonstrate manhood might be different, but it's the same general idea. Then, during the 19th century, urbanization would clearly have a huge impact on what's expected for you to be considered a man. And instead of staying in smaller places, young men were much more likely to leave home. And this is why Rotundo calls the 19th century the age of the self-made man, self-made manhood. Because instead of carrying on their family homestead, young men were expected to make a life for themselves away from their family. So this was a time of growing individualism, a little bit of Durkheim, if you remember from your intro Soc. More emphasis on yourself instead of being completely focused on the community. This is really when a shift from collectivism to individualism is taking place. So instead of being expected to be interdependent, a young man is expected to be independent. He's expected to make his own way in life apart from his family. So this idea of self-made manhood emerged. Emphasis on individualism, not being interdependent, emphasis on competition, and really defining who you are in relation to your work. So don't misunderstand this. Absolutely being a provider and protector were still considered important, but the manner in which you would be a provider and what it meant to be a protector changed. Now, there's a similarity here between men and women, because just like I said, young women benefited from a whole variety of public organizations specifically for them, so too did young men. Now be warned, they may not sound like much fun to us now with everything we have available, but at the time it was considered positive. So, literary societies are what we would call book clubs. There were debating societies. They'd get together and discuss different points of view. Of course, various religious groups. Fraternal lodges, which are in a way a precursor to university fraternities, because these were places where a group of men would spend time together, kind of like in a spirit of brotherhood. And of course, the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, very similar to the Organization for Girls, all about good, clean fun and developing into righteous, confident young men. Now, something with the men's groups, however, is they also really focused on self-control, which might sound kind of odd to our modern ears. Um, yes, they focused on how to contribute to your community, how to be an upstanding community member, but in terms of self-control, that meant sexual self-control. And for the men's organizations, this was a particular focus because it was recognized that during adolescence, young men would have all these sexual feelings emerging, these newly discovered sexual impulses, and it was thought that the best way to deal with this was physical activity. Keep them as physical as you possibly can. The more strenuous, the better. So, running, any kind of competitive sport or otherwise, participating in what they would call calisthenics and what we would call doing kind of military drills, that sort of thing. Especially in urban areas where people lived in a much smaller area with a much higher density of population, this was a big concern. But a big difference between the male and the female organizations is that the male organizations were less likely to be as closely supervised. So, perhaps not surprisingly, sometimes they would not include quite as much good, clean family fun and include things like drinking and so forth. Now, proceeding further in history, Rotondo calls the 20th century the era of passionate manhood. So, still much more of a focus on individualism, not interdependence. And this is when we really begin to see the early start of more of a focus on assertiveness and aggression and sexual desire is the ideal. So, in this era, Rotundo says that what he calls passionate emotions emerge, like anger and sexual desire and that sort of thing. Um, and these are closely connected to what it means to be a manly man, to what it means to reach this masculine ideal. So there's much more of a focus on this masculine ideal as a whole. I'm sorry if this is a bit choppy. I'm trying to keep my dogs from barking, so I have to keep pausing it. So we have these differences in gender socialization for men and for women across time and between cultures, but also differences within a single culture. This is referred to as differential gender socialization. So males and females are socialized according to different expectations in terms of attitude and behavior. And as I've already said, this begins very, very early. We could spend one entire class or more talking about all of the ways male and female infants and toddlers and children are socialized according to their gender by their parents, often without the parents really being aware that that's what they're doing. Now, this has been recognized for decades. It's nothing new, and you can find a whole ton of studies that demonstrate this. It's something that nobody in any discipline doubts at this point. In the course of growing up, children continue to be subject to differential gender socialization. Sometimes they are encouraged to conform to these norms. Sometimes they are taught them in a subtle way. And sometimes they're outright instructed to. This is one of the few areas where, regarding gender and gender expectations, that girls actually have an advantage over boys. Because especially as younger children, girls have much more leeway regarding gender than boys do. If a little girl starts to play with a truck or some cars or does something else that's considered typically male, it doesn't cause as much difficulty for her as if a boy starts to do something that's generally considered typically female. He's going to be ridiculed or teased or something similar. So a girl can be not very feminine in her behavior and her preferences and how she dresses, and that's generally perceived to be okay. But when a boy is not as masculine as typically expected, if he acts more feminine or has feminine preferences, that's viewed as a sign of something. He's a sissy, he's too girly. It really is a double standard. And again, there are a whole whack of studies that provide evidence of gender intensification that accompanies adolescence, and differential socialization absolutely plays into this. Now, we've already talked quite a bit about how cognitive development evolves and that there are other processes that occur at the same time as cognitive development because they're dependent on the brain evolving. The progression of moral development is dependent on the progression of cognitive development. And developing ideas about gender are also dependent on cognitive development. At the very surface, before we even go into detail, this makes a lot of thought to me. If you're going to have a deeper understanding of something, it's going to require a deeper level of cognitive thought. So, how does this happen? Well, we're going to swing back to Lawrence Kohlberg and his ideas about moral development previously. He also proposed a theory of gender development known as the cognitive developmental theory of gender. Personally, I find his ideas about gender much clearer and much easier to understand than his ideas about cognitive development. Having said that, Kohlberg said that socialization, just socialization in general, interacts with cognitive development, and this is what produces an adolescent's ideas about gender. So let's take this piece by piece. Socialization interacts with cognitive development to produce an adolescent's ideas about gender. So as a person's brain and thought processes develop, this includes being affected by socialization, and part of socialization includes ideas about gender. Okay, and gender is a fundamental way of organizing ideas about the world. That's pretty direct. Kohlberg says that by about 3 years old, a child will understand gender identity. So they understand that they're male or female. It might not be in exactly the same way an adult will, but they have a basic understanding of being male or female. And once this happens, they use their understanding of gender to help organize the world around them. So whatever they encounter, they're going to use their gender knowledge to understand it, to sort it, to organize it. Remember, I spoke before about schema, that we all develop schemas in our brain that are kind of just like categories used to classify things, like our brain is a filing cabinet. And so a schema technically is a mental structure for organizing and interpreting information. Well, this is the same thing, but these schema are based on gender and classifying things according to gender. So you have a masculine file and a feminine file in your brain. And once a child understands gender identity, they just use it as one more schema to understand their world. So this is gender schema theory. So they begin to say that certain toys are for girls or boys, certain colors, certain TV shows, movies, maybe even household chores. So they think that girls look after the kitchen and boys cut the lawn. Everything you can think of. Kohlberg says they've been socialized according to their gender. They now understand they are either male or female and what that means. And this becomes a process and an understanding that is no longer just external to them. Instead, once males and females have these gender schemas established in their brain, which happens from a very early age, they then even begin to self-socialize and monitor themselves. So in other words, they begin to understand what the norms of gender are, what's masculine and what's feminine, and they not just incorporate it to monitor other people and what they encounter, they also begin to monitor themselves. So a little boy will want to be masculine and a little girl will want to be feminine. And there's lots of examples about this. Just to give you a very quick, small personal example, when my son started junior kindergarten, I never made it a point to encourage him to play with girls' um, toys, but I never instructed him not to. About 2 weeks after he started junior kindergarten, he came home and he announced to me that he couldn't play with dolls anymore. And I said, why? And he said, because they're for girls. So he now had that as part of his gender schema in his brain. In relation to adolescence, this all becomes much, much, much more significant and more intense once somebody reaches adolescence. They become more concerned with fitting into the categories that they have been socialized to create. Now, Sandra Bem is one of the leading supporters of gender schema theory, and she says also that people don't just apply their gender schemas to the world around them, they apply them to themselves. So, in other words, we evaluate ourselves according to standards of gender that we have internalized through various sources. And sociology would say that we have internalized through various agents of socialization. So, whatever the cultural definition of being masculine or feminine in your culture, you self-monitor. And during adolescence, this self-monitoring intensifies because gender intensification occurs. A person increasingly thinks of themselves and of everything they encounter in terms of what is masculine or feminine. So, what do we all generally think then is masculine or feminine? Well, way back in the 70s, even I was just a little kid, the BEM Sex Role Inventory was created, the BSRI, and for a very long time, this was the most widely used measure of gender role expectations. So just to give you an idea of what it encompassed, it had 60 items, 20 that were stereotypically masculine, 20 that were stereotypically feminine, and 20 that were considered kind of gender neutral. So typical masculine traits would be leader, aggressive, dominant. Typical feminine traits would be affectionate, gentle, warm. And the kind of gender neutral filler items, for example, would be adaptable or happy or healthful. And respondents were asked to rate themselves on these. And if you look at the scale, you'll see a clear pattern. So these are all terms that were used in the actual BSRI to give you an idea. In general, it was discovered that femininity is associated with being nurturing. So terms like sympathetic, compassionate, gentle. Femininity is associated with being compliant. So being yielding or soft-spoken or childlike. Just a second, gotta flip the page. At the same time, it was discovered that masculinity is associated with being independent. So terms like self-reliant or self-sufficient or individualistic. And masculinity was associated with being aggressive, which is demonstrated through terms like assertive or forceful or dominant. So to me, we could just summarize all of this, that stereotypical gender traits seem to dominate. Now, the difference in these traits is that gender roles have been described as a contrast between expressive and instrumental traits. So the expressive traits, that term generally refers to traits that are considered stereotypically female. And instrumental traits refers to those terms that are considered stereotypically male. And especially in developed countries like ours, gender socialization with these stereotypical traits takes place pretty consistently through various agents of socialization. Parents, peers, friends, schools, and the media. The media is especially guilty of this. Television shows, movies, music videos, magazines, And most often, these do adhere to stereotypes about gender. There are very, very specific messages conveyed through the media in terms of expectations and physical appearance. And even just traditional media, and by that I mean not including the internet. Studies of traditional media for decades have very clearly shown a relation between how much traditional media is consumed and body image, especially for adolescent girls. And remember that a person is much more likely to pick up on messages in the media that already coincides with gender schema that they have. So, girls are much more likely to pick up on and file away information regarding gender expectations if this information already fits with the schema that they have, if it already easily fits into the categories they have. Just looking at the magazines whose target audience is adolescent girls and young women, you don't need me to tell you that they relentlessly focus on physical appearance. Fashion and beauty and weight are the most common topics. How to wear eyeshadow, or the most stylish way to wear your hair, what the color trends are for that season for clothes and makeup. So it isn't just weight control in these magazines, although that tends to be the first thing we think of. It's literally everything you can possibly think of that has to do with physical appearance. When there are articles about health in these magazines, most are about weight reduction and control, whether they come right out and say that or not. So sure, they may be packaged and marketed on how to eat healthy, how to eat well, or something similar. But for the most part, weight control is at the basis of these. And this doesn't even include the advertisements. The underlying message of these is, this is how you should want to look in order to be considered attractive, or even just acceptable. So it's not surprising then that researchers have concluded that exposure to unrealistic ideals in traditional media has a negative effect on girls' body image. I mean, this seems like such a simple, straightforward statement, but it's also a really heavy statement. Exposure to unrealistic ideals in traditional media has negative effects on girls' body image. And we're so used to it, but this is huge. Think of those advertisements from the 1950s about breast size and making your breast look as big and upright as possible. So this pressure to adhere to an ideal has been going on for a very long time. To me, it's just common sense, and you could apply it to anything. If all you see are pictures of muscle cars that are completely souped up, that's all you see on TV and in the movies and in advertisements, then you're going to want a muscle car. If all you see are pictures of people driving a pickup, you're going to want a pickup. And because you're constantly exposed to these pictures, it isn't the picture, it's the consistency and the underlying message, the consistency of the underlying message. This is what you should want. This is what everybody should find attractive. This is the ideal, and this is the norm. And we all buy into it, myself included, even though we know that this is an unattainable physical ideal for most people. We're not stupid people. We know that magazines and advertisements present unrealistic ideals, that the people in them tend to be models who are made up and fussed over, with professional lighting and a dresser and makeup artist and everything that goes into a photo shoot. And then all the photos are airbrushed to eliminate any tiny little imperfection that might still manage to make it into the pictures. So we're not unintelligent people, but most of us still look at these pictures and think, oh, I'd like to look like that. And then add into the mix social media that adolescents and teens and emerging adults are pretty much obsessed with. Facebook, MySpace, Snapchat, Twitter, all of that. And I'll admit, a lot of it I've never been on. A huge percentage of these are photos that people post of themselves and of their family and friends without all the advantages of a professional photography studio. So you would think then that using social media would not have comparable negative effects on body image and self-evaluation because most of us don't have the ability to airbrush pictures or professional makeup artists or all that. However, research indicates that's not the case. And instead, social media also has a very negative effect on adolescent girls and their body image. Now, am I just picking on girls here? My focus has been on girls, and most research is on females. So it kind of makes it sound like girls are just so flighty and so silly and so gullible that they get caught up in all of these fake ideals, these supposed standards of beauty. I'm not just picking on young girls because we already know that physical appearance tends to be a more prominent part of gender socialization for females than it is for males. And there is more attention being given to the same for boys in this regard as well. In general, the effect of the media, whether it's professional media or social media, does affect boys and their self-perception. They feel pressure from society to meet an ideal. If you just look at popular movies, whether they're movies for adolescents or for teens or emerging adults, there continues to be the stereotype of being an athlete, being in really good shape and being popular and being muscular, being really well coordinated and able to look after things. Being a man means being capable. Absolutely, this continues to be a stereotype, an ideal that young boys are encouraged to strive for because this is the masculine ideal. And I really, really feel this is part of the reason why TV shows like The Big Bang Theory were so popular. Not just because they're funny, but because they're about men who don't even come close to reaching this masculine ideals. And they're aware that they don't, and they're still okay. So every once in a while, in The Big Bang Theory, the character of Leonard would make a reference to the fact that he's not a stereotypically overtly masculine man. But it was always within the context of, I know I don't measure up and I'm still okay. So I really feel like because the male characters in this show are so anti-stereotype, that's part of the reason why it was so successful. For boys, at the core of their gender role in adolescence is typically an expectation to be aggressive. Not necessarily physically aggressive, but assertive. This expectation that they're always going to have this ability to be a go-getter. And during adolescence, boys do tend to be expected by their peers more than girls are to be assertive, to take charge, to be assertive verbally and sometimes physically. And just like for girls, at adolescence, these expectations intensify dramatically. And it's going to be interesting, I think, to see if new forms of social media will have an effect at all or a differential effect. It would be kind of neat if somebody did very, very specific studies in a series in terms of what specific medium of media make a difference. So do adolescents with a Snapchat account demonstrate different feelings about their own gender and their own self-worth, or different expectations of the opposite gender compared to adolescents with a MySpace or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is? So pulling all of this together then, overall, we know that for both boys and girls, the intensified gender socialization they experience in adolescence can be a source of problems. For girls, the focus on physical appearance that's really at the heart of the female gender role can produce a lot of distress, to put it very lightly. Adolescent girls are much more likely than adolescent boys to develop a negative body image. Doesn't mean that adolescent boys won't or can't, but it's much more intense for girls. And even long after adolescence, a lot of adult women continue to be dissatisfied with their physical appearance. And I want to point out that it isn't just that a girl is consciously thinking about this every moment of the day. It really is like an undercurrent that is always there. Even when you're not overtly focusing on your physical appearance, it's like it's always there in your peripheral vision to some degree. And because these ideals are so pervasive, it's almost impossible to get away from them. Now, for boys, physical appearance is part of it. That's certainly important. But for boys, it's more of an ideal of personality and capability of being assertive. So, just to summarize all of this, we've looked at gender during adolescence in traditional cultures, how girls have more contact with their families, particularly female family members, and their socialization becomes much more narrow, while gender socialization for males during adolescence typically stays the same or becomes even more broad. Becoming a woman is an inevitability for girls, but becoming a man is something that has to be achieved for boys. It's not a guarantee. Talked about male and female circumcision in traditional societies and how that is increasingly becoming an issue for Western societies. Little bit about globalization and attempts to stop female circumcision. We jumped to Western societies and looked at how girls were historically constricted. For boys, how the idea of manhood itself has changed, what it means to be a man. I brought in gender intensification hypothesis, how it affects girls and boys differently, and differential gender socialization. But for boys and girls, gender socialization intensifies during adolescence. And I talked about how, especially for girls, how they tend to have negative body image during adolescence much more than boys. I talked about gender schema theory and Lawrence Kohlberg and his cognitive developmental theory of gender, how we all organize the world around us, at least in part according to gender. So there's a lot of information in this chapter. I hope that it is a little easier to understand maybe than in previous chapters. I hope that you can relate what you've experienced growing up, what you currently experience now, according to how you've been socialized according to gender, and how you see the people around you being socialized according to gender. So feel free to go back and rewatch or re-listen to any of the parts of the chapter. And don't forget to do your quiz for this chapter.